What if the woman who never wore a crown was the one who sealed the fate of two kingdoms? The night in Edinburgh was heavy with smoke as guards burst into a house already half in ruins. They searched for ashes, but what they found was far more chilling. Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, lay lifeless in the garden, his fine clothes hardly touched by flame, his neck bound by a cord. One guard whispered in disbelief, words that cut through the silence like a blade. He was not burned. He was strangled. That murder was not an isolated crime. It was the echo of a hidden bloodline that history tried to erase. Behind that corpse stood the shadow of his mother, Lady Margaret Douglas. She was Henry VIII's niece, born into promise yet trapped in suspicion. A woman whose heart beat for love but whose romances were treated as treason. Twice she was thrown into prison for following desire. Twice she nearly lost her life for daring to dream of more than the court allowed her. Yet from her came the grandson who would sit on both the English and Scottish thrones. James VI of Scotland, James I of England. Margaret was no queen, yet her story is carved deeper than many who wore the crown. She loved and was punished. She hoped and was betrayed. She died half forgotten. Yet her bloodline became the bridge that united realms long divided. Stay until the very end of this tale, and you will see how the Tudors' most dangerous secret reshaped the destiny of Europe. Subscribe now, because what lies ahead is not a mere chronicle, but the hidden truth of power, betrayal, and survival that still haunts history. In the winter of 1515, within the cold stone walls of Harbottle Castle, on the English border with Scotland, a child was born who carried the weight of two nations in her veins. Lady Margaret Douglas entered a world already scarred by betrayal and ambition. Her mother was Margaret Tudor, once Queen of Scotland and sister to Henry VIII of England, a woman who had defied political expectation by marrying for survival after her husband, James IV, fell at Flodden. Her father was Archibald Douglas, a restless Scottish noble whose loyalty shifted like the wind. This union was troubled from the start, yet from it came a daughter who would be forced to live as both pawn and prisoner of her lineage. Margaret's earliest years were marked by the turbulence of her parents' failed marriage. Her mother's throne in Scotland was fragile, her father's power unstable. When the storm of politics became too fierce, the young girl was carried across the border into England, to be raised under the eye of her powerful uncle, King Henry VIII. Within the glittering yet treacherous court of the Tudors, she was educated in languages, music, and scripture. Courtiers would later remark on her charm and her keen wit. To many, she appeared destined for greatness, a bright star in the constellation of royal blood. But the Tudor court was not a place where innocence could flourish. Every smile, every alliance, every glance carried meaning. Children of royal blood were not free to love as they chose, nor to live as they pleased. They were pieces on a board, and Margaret learned early that her very existence was both a gift and a danger. She was close enough to the throne to be seen as a potential heir, yet distant enough to be overlooked when convenient. That delicate balance made her vulnerable to the shifting moods of the king who ruled over her. Still, as a young woman, she carried the aura of promise. She was beautiful by the standards of her age, with striking features inherited from both English and Scottish lines. Songs at court described her as lively and spirited, a lady whose presence drew attention without her ever needing to demand it. Noblemen whispered of her future, some daring to imagine her as a queen consort who might cement alliances across borders. For a time, she seemed to embody the golden potential of a new generation of Tudors. one that might rise above the bloodshed and betrayals that had already marked her family. Yet beneath the polish of courtly dances and the murmurs of admiration, there was an undertow darker than she could see. Being raised near Henry VIII meant being raised in a world where fortune could turn to ruin in a single heartbeat. Servants were executed for careless words. Queens were discarded for failing to produce sons. Nobles were destroyed for plots both real and imagined. A girl like Margaret, with royal blood and charm enough to attract suitors, could never walk unobserved. As she grew into womanhood, her life became a silent test. Every friendship could be a risk, every admirer a trap. She lived in an environment where even a whispered promise of affection could summon suspicion from the throne. And yet, in those early years, she did not shrink. She laughed, she sang, she learned. She was a young woman still believing that love might be stronger than politics, that the fire in her heart could outshine the cold calculations of power. It was this hope, nurtured in her youth, that would soon collide with the ruthless machinery of the Tudor dynasty. Margaret Douglas would discover that, in Henry VIII's England, the higher one's blood, the sharper the knife that awaited them in the dark. By the time Margaret Douglas reached her late teens, the atmosphere of Henry VIII's court had shifted from pageantry to paranoia. The king had begun his ruthless reshaping of marriage and succession, discarding wives and bending church and law alike to his will. For a young woman of royal blood, every gesture could become political currency. It was in this climate that Margaret's heart led her toward a path more perilous than she could imagine. Thomas Howard was not just any courtier. He was the nephew of the Duke of Norfolk, one of the most powerful noble families in England, handsome, ambitious, and skilled in the art of courtly charm. Thomas carried himself with a quiet boldness. When his eyes met Margaret's across the polished floors of Whitehall, something unspoken passed between them. Whispers grew into secret letters, letters into promises, and promises into an unspoken betrothal. To them, it was love. To the king, it was treason waiting to unfold. In stolen moments behind the tapestries of the palace, Margaret and Thomas allowed themselves the fantasy of a future together. "Your hand," Thomas once whispered, lifting her fingers to his lips, "is worth more to me than any crown." For Margaret, who had grown up in the shadow of suspicion, these words felt like freedom. She believed she had found a companion strong enough to withstand the storms of power. But in a court where every word echoed, secrets never remained hidden for long. The news reached Henry VIII like a spark landing on dry tinder. His fury was swift and merciless. A union between his niece and a Howard threatened to create a rival claim to the throne, one that could split loyalties and ignite factions. Margaret was dragged from the luxuries of court to the stone walls of the Tower of London. Thomas joined her there, accused of presumption beyond his station. Inside the tower, Margaret endured the chill of betrayal from those who once called her friend. The woman who had danced in silks was now confined in silence, her fate uncertain. In another cell, Thomas grew thin from neglect, his spirit dimming as weeks turned to months. Margaret was allowed no word from him, no touch, no reassurance. Only the echo of his voice remained in her memory, a fragile thread against the suffocating weight of stone and iron. When word finally reached her, it struck like a dagger. Thomas was dead. He had perished in captivity, weakened and forgotten, his love story extinguished in the dark. Margaret was spared execution, but the price of survival was heavy. She walked out of the tower with her heart shattered and her reputation scarred. The court would never look at her the same way again. Every smile carried suspicion. Every kind word concealed a knife. Yet, even in grief, she did not vanish. Margaret Douglas learned to wear her sorrow like armor. She returned to the world of politics not as an innocent girl, but as a woman hardened by loss. Her survival alone was a testament to her resilience in a court where so many others fell. The dream of love had been stolen, yet a new role awaited her, one she had not chosen but could no longer escape: the role of dynastic bride, a living bridge between thrones. This transformation, born in the shadows of the tower, marked the beginning of her ascent to a position more dangerous than any crown. For in the blood of Margaret Douglas now burned not only Tudor fire, but the memory of a love destroyed, a memory that would shape the choices leading her deeper into history's most perilous game. After the shadow of the tower, Margaret Douglas stepped into a new chapter of her life, one written not in the ink of romance but in the ink of strategy. The court whispered of her resilience, of how she had survived when others had been buried by Henry's wrath. In those whispers lay both fear and fascination. To some she was dangerous, to others she was indispensable. It was within this atmosphere that her marriage to Matthew Stuart, Earl of Lennox, was arranged. A union that would bind her once again to the dangerous heart of politics. Matthew was no idle nobleman. He was a man of Scottish blood, ambitious and calculating, a figure whose claim to influence reached across the border into Scotland's restless realm. Their marriage in 1544 was more than a union of hearts. It was a contract of dynasties. Margaret had loved before and lost all. But this time the stakes were no longer personal. Now, her womb was expected to become the seedbed of power, her children the instruments of alliance. In the grand halls, where the couple first appeared together, courtiers measured every glance they exchanged. Margaret's beauty had matured into a colder radiance, the look of a woman who had known despair and learned to master it. Matthew carried himself with the proud air of a man who had won not just a wife, but proximity to England's throne. Together, they were admired and feared, a pair whose very presence was a reminder of how fragile succession could be. When their son Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, was born, Margaret's hopes flared anew. She looked into the child's face and saw both the Tudor and the Stuart blood coursing through his veins. "You will be greater than us both," she is said to have whispered as she cradled him. To her, he was not merely a child, but the living embodiment of reconciliation between two crowns long divided. In him, she imagined the promise of unity, the possibility of peace secured by lineage. But with promise came peril. Elizabeth I, ever watchful, looked upon Margaret with narrowed eyes. A niece of Henry VIII, a mother of a boy with a legitimate claim to 2 thrones. Margaret's position was both exalted and precarious. Each letter she wrote, each ally she courted, was studied for hidden meaning. Elizabeth trusted few, and she trusted Margaret least of all. Rumors began to circle, the kind of whispers that could rot reputations and fracture alliances. Some said Margaret dreamed not for her son, but for herself, that she longed to rule through him. Others claimed Matthew Stuart schemed endlessly, preparing the boy as a rival heir to Elizabeth's fragile line. Whether truth or fabrication, these stories spread through the corridors like fire through dry timber. Margaret could feel the distance growing around her. Where once she had been the shining niece of a king, now she was the suspect matron of a potential usurper. At banquets, her laughter was met with silence. In chapel, her prayers were observed with suspicion. Even the courtiers who bowed before her did so with an edge of caution in their eyes. Yet Margaret did not falter. She wore suspicion as she had once worn sorrow, as something to be carried rather than surrendered to. For in her son she saw destiny unfolding, and she believed the bloodline she had fought to preserve through prison and disgrace would one day blaze with undeniable light. Still, in the dim corridors of power, the question lingered: was Margaret Douglas the dutiful mother of a prince, or the silent architect of a claim that could topple queens? It was in that tension, between admiration and fear, that her story pressed forward. The seeds of triumph had been planted, but already the air trembled with the sound of conspiracies growing unseen. The promise Margaret Douglas had placed in her son did not lead to triumph. It led to a night of fire and betrayal that shattered everything she had fought to protect. In February of 1567, the streets of Edinburgh echoed with the crackle of flames as Kirk O'Field erupted into chaos. Neighbors rushed to their windows and saw the glow rising against the night. They expected to find Lord Darnley consumed in the inferno. Instead, when the smoke cleared, his body was discovered lying in the garden, untouched by fire, his neck bound by strangling hands. The city whispered of treachery. Scotland trembled with suspicion. For Margaret, the news arrived like a poisoned dagger driven straight into her heart. She had carried Darnley as her hope, her living bridge between Tudor and Stuart, the boy she had raised to embody the destiny of two kingdoms. Now, he was gone, not taken by illness or fate, but by the knives of men who conspired in darkness. The mother who once cradled him was left with silence. His marriage to Mary, Queen of Scots, had already been stained with quarrels and betrayal. Now his murder turned every promise to ash. Margaret received the message in England, her body tightening with grief, her mind spinning with disbelief. She clutched at letters and reports, searching for fragments of truth. But each account was more damning than the last. The weight of sorrow bore heavily upon her. Friends recorded that she aged visibly in the months after his death. Once proud in posture, she began to stoop as if the air itself pressed her downward. Her eyes, once bright with determination, dulled with an exhaustion that no rest could cure. At meals, she barely touched food, her appetite consumed by despair. Servants whispered that she often sat alone, lips moving without sound, as if speaking to her dead son in the stillness of the night. Illness soon followed grief. Margaret's health faltered with fevers that came and went like shadows. Her hands shook as she held a pen. Yet she continued to write letters, begging for justice, pleading for the truth behind Darnley's murder. But the truth was poisoned by politics. Some accused Mary, Queen of Scots herself. Others pointed at rival nobles, each more ruthless than the next. The truth mattered less than the power gained from twisting it, and Margaret was left with nothing but suspicions that clawed at her mind. As months bled into years, her sorrow hardened into a cage. Those around her saw a woman diminished, not by age alone, but by relentless grief. She no longer moved through court as she once had. Instead, she drifted at its edges, a ghost in fine garments, present but never truly seen. The courtiers who once admired her kept their distance, as though her tragedy was contagious. Elizabeth I's suspicion of her did not fade either. For in grief, Margaret remained dangerous. A grieving mother could be more unpredictable than an ambitious courtier, and Elizabeth never trusted the fire that still flickered in her eyes. Margaret lived as though trapped between life and death, her body weakened, her spirit broken, yet her will still clinging to one fragile thread of hope. That thread was her grandson, James, the small boy left behind by Darnley and Mary. To him, she poured the remnants of her strength, believing that in his veins still flowed the unity of two crowns. But in her own body, the decline was relentless. Pain spread through her frame. Exhaustion bound her like chains, and her mind circled endlessly around the memory of her son lying strangled in the night. Margaret Douglas did not die on the night her son was murdered, but in many ways she stopped living. What remained was a slow descent, a body breaking, a heart still beating only because destiny demanded it. The final years of Margaret Douglas unfolded like the fading notes of a dirge, quiet, yet heavy with meaning. She no longer walked through the courts with the sharp grace of youth, nor with the steady composure of her middle years. Instead, she moved slowly, carrying the weight of loss in every step. By the summer of 1578, her body was failing, but her mind still clung to the single thought that had kept her alive after Darnley's murder. Her grandson James was growing, and with him the fragile thread of her bloodline still wound itself into the fabric of history. Her death did not arrive with spectacle. There were no armed guards, no weeping crowds, no royal pageantry. She was not a queen, and yet she bore the presence of one until the end. In a dim chamber in London, with only a few attendants close by, she lay wrapped in silence. The air smelled of candle wax and fading flowers, the kind of scent that lingers at the edge of memory. Those who saw her in those last hours said her face carried both exhaustion and defiance. She had been broken by sorrow, but not erased. One servant, loyal through years of suspicion, bent close to her bed. He later recalled that she whispered of her grandson, of the boy she believed would one day sit on a throne greater than any she had touched. Her lips formed a single sentence, fragile but resolute. Let him be stronger than us all. With that, her eyes closed and her chest fell still. No trumpets sounded, no crowds gathered, only the hushed prayers of those few who dared to mourn her openly. When word spread, it carried less the weight of shock than of inevitability. Margaret Douglas was gone, yet she left behind a silence that seemed to echo louder than triumph. She was buried within Westminster Abbey, a resting place for queens and kings, though her own crown had been only imagined. The funeral was restrained, absent of grandeur, but her presence there was undeniable. Among the monuments of rulers, she claimed her place in stone, a reminder that power often moves through shadows rather than light. Her end was quiet, almost invisible to the world that had once watched her with suspicion. Yet in that stillness lay the greatest paradox. Margaret died without fanfare, but her blood had already shaped the course of nations. The boy she left behind would grow into James VI of Scotland, and later James I of England, the first to unite two crowns into one. Her final breath marked the conclusion of a life haunted by grief, but her absence opened the door to a new era. Margaret Douglas slipped from the world as a prisoner of her losses. Yet history remembers her as the silent architect of a dynasty. The silence that followed Margaret Douglas's death did not last. Within a generation, her name rose again, not shouted from rooftops, but carried in the blood of the boy she had once whispered about in her final hours. When Elizabeth I of England died childless in 1603, the throne she had guarded with suspicion and iron will passed not to one of her trusted nobles, nor to any descendant of her father's many wives. It went to James VI of Scotland, the grandson of Margaret Douglas. The crowns of England and Scotland, divided for centuries, were suddenly worn by a single man. The irony could not be missed. The woman who had never been crowned, who had been imprisoned for love and left to wither in suspicion, became the silent bridge that carried power across borders. Her story was not told in ballads or triumphal processions. It was etched in lineage, carved into the royal seal itself. Those who once dismissed her as dangerous and expendable were forced to see her shadow stretching across Europe. History often chooses its heroes loudly. Yet sometimes it is the figures who suffer in silence that shape the future most profoundly. Margaret Douglas was never raised upon a throne, yet her bloodline sat upon two. She never wore a coronation robe, yet through her veins ran the thread that stitched nations together. Her life had been filled with loss and betrayal, but her legacy was carved in iron, uniting crowns that had long been enemies. In Westminster Abbey, among the monuments of kings and queens, lies the woman whose face few remember, but whose blood reshaped the map of Britain. Her tomb is quiet, her name carved in stone rather than shouted in memory. And yet, every time the story of James I is told, every time the tale of England and Scotland's union is remembered, the echo of Margaret Douglas lingers, the echo of the woman who was never meant to rule, but ruled nonetheless through her descendants. This is the truth history tried to bury, the truth of a bloodline hidden in plain sight, a woman whose suffering and silence became the seed of a dynasty. She is not remembered with crowns and jewels, but she is remembered in consequence, and that is the memory that endures longest of all. If this story has opened your eyes to the shadows that linger behind royal power, then stay with us. There are countless more lives, forgotten and silenced, that changed history in ways the world rarely admits. Like, share, and subscribe, and walk with us through the dark corridors of the past, where the forgotten still whisper, and the buried truths rise again.